Hi, everyone. First of all, can we just give a big round of applause to the organizers for putting on this really amazing event? Like, they did such a great job. I am so honored to be a part of this conference because as an underrepresented minority, I don't always have the ear of so many people in leadership. And I'm tired. And not just because I'm an overachiever who was up all night rewriting my slides, but because as a URM, I spend a lot of my energy in this industry assimilating. I spend a lot of my time reshaping my behavior and changing the way that I act around other people so that I don't make them uncomfortable, so that we can all get along better, so that we can work as a team better. But there are many parts of my identity that I won't compromise. My ethics, my integrity, my values. And so this talk was inspired by this poem by Allen Ginsberg, Howl, and the opening line, which is very famous, and I'm sure you've heard, that I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked. And he goes on to describe the ways that society was restricting the self-expression and free thought of his peers, specifically in terms of mental illness. But Howl is a poem about announcing the coming of a new culture and an end to the dead habits of the past. And for me, as a URM, the work that I do towards inclusion often feels like I'm howling for equality. And this howl has lasted for centuries. And I'm just one in a line of many. After the Birmingham movement in 1963, Bobby Kennedy, who was Attorney General at the time, asked James Baldwin to arrange a meeting of the minds. James Baldwin brought together famous activists like the playwright Lorraine Hansberry, who wrote the play A Raisin in the Sun, Harry Belafonte, a famous calypso singer and also activist, Lena Horne, a famous jazz singer. Rip Torn was there too, which I really want to hear his take on what happened. But there were other important activists, Clarence Benjamin Jones, who was Martin Luther King Jr.'s lawyer and advisor, Edwin Berry, who was director of the Chicago Urban League. And Edwin Berry brought someone who was in the trenches, a young man named Jerome Smith, who was a freedom writer and was associated with CORE, which was the Congress of Racial Equality. And in Robert Kennedy and His Times by Arthur Schlesinger, I cannot pronounce anyone's name, so please forgive me because I learned how to pronounce everything by reading, so I might be pronouncing things wrong. So I apologize in advance, but in Arthur Schlesinger's account, he wrote that Jerome Smith suddenly began to weep as if he just suffered some traumatic flashback. And he was nauseated by the necessity of being in the room with Bobby Kennedy, who wasn't open to hearing the ideas that these activists had brought to the table. Bobby Kennedy took it very personally and turned away from him and turned to the other more well-known people in the room. And James Baldwin wrote that that was a mistake because as he turned towards us, thinking that we were the reasonable, responsible, mature representatives of the Black community, Lorraine Hansberry said, "You've got a great many very accomplished people in this room, Mr. Attorney General, but the only man who you should be listening to is that man over there," referring to Jerome Smith. Lena Horne later said that this boy just put it like it was. He communicated the plain, basic suffering and took us back to the common dirt of our existence and rubbed our noses in it. You could not encompass his anger, his fury in a set of statistics, nor could we keep up the pretense of being the mature, responsible spokespeople for the race. This is a sentiment that I hear about all the time on Twitter from Black Lives Matter activists, from people who are just asking to be allowed to be who they are. And what Bobby Kennedy ignored was the context of the situation. He didn't want to believe through all of the emotion that these people were having that their experience was worth honoring. And he failed as a leader because he wasn't taking responsibility for his power and listening to their experience. As leads, managers, and people in position of leadership, we need to recognize the power we wield and be responsible for it. We need to find positive ways to wield the fire that we bring to our teams, the fire that, as Danny Myers, who is a restaurateur who wrote this book called Setting the Table, that's a fantastic book on servant leadership, writes about how the fire that we bring as managers is a tool that we can use to help bring positive outcomes to our team. You can do this by deferring to the expertise of underrepresented minorities, delegating them work of value, amplifying their voices, modeling your work after the successes of URMs, giving them letting them be role models, leveraging your privilege to help, involving ourselves directly towards working towards solutions, and most importantly, listening and believing our accounts of our experiences. I am rarely believed. This graphic perfectly illustrates every job I've had in tech. It illustrates something that is an underrepresented minority who's had to work many times harder. I always thought that this was a strength and not a disadvantage. In fact, Danny Myers, who we just saw a second ago, wrote about it also in Setting the Table, and he calls it excellence reflex, which is a natural reaction to fix something that isn't right or to improve something that could be better. The excellence reflex is rooted in instinct and upbringing and then constantly honed through awareness, caring, and practice. We need more people with privilege to hone their excellence reflex and pay attention to our experiences. And speaking of privilege, having privilege isn't inherently bad. As Shakespeare wrote in Hamlet, nothing is good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So let's invert the conversation about privilege. Instead of considering the things that you have that you feel you might be scared to let go of, let's consider the opposite side of the equation and invert the conversation. In Claude Steele's book, Whistling Vivaldi, he uses these terms that I really appreciated. The book is about stereotypes and how they affect us. It's about the social psychology research that Dr. Steele did to prove the ways that stereotypes have measurable effects on the futures of underrepresented minorities. And right now, the popular discourse centers the white experience by referring to privilege. But we need to consider the opposite side of the equation. And not just, it applies to everyone. It doesn't just apply to underrepresented minorities. Everyone has identity contingencies, which are things that you have to deal with in a situation because you have a given social identity. And those identity contingencies, when combined with stigma pressure, is what creates a stereotype threat, which is the inverse of privilege. It's the things that we as URMs have to be constantly aware of, and that W.E.B. Du Bois called double consciousness. As an underrepresented minority, I always know the different stereotypes that I might be subjected to. I'm always living in a state of cognitive dissonance where, and I've formed habits as a means of detection to see if I'm being subjected to those stereotypes, and also as a means of self-defense. Sometimes when I'm with my friends, I call it emotional trauma hypochondria, because it's like you're so constantly afraid of being subjected to more emotional trauma that you'll do everything in your power to have control over the situation and make sure that people don't interpret you as being a subject of those stereotypes. Consider how the healthcare industry minimizes the complaints of women, especially Black women, and how they're dying. This is a very serious consideration to see how the ways that these stereotypes mean that people get treated differently. And minimizing is the thing that I want to talk about most today. It's the most socially acceptable dehumanization tool. Minimizing someone's experience neutralizes and silences the call out of injustice. I found a fantastic blog that was written by a man named Matthew Remski, titled On Minimization as a Patriarchal Reflex, and he described thinking that people were exaggerating and that he didn't believe them and that it really couldn't be that bad, but realizing that you don't have to assault women to participate in the normalization of assault. Default responses are participation enough. Violence, assault, and murder are so prevalent because they're built on the foundation of small toxic habits. Toxic habits like what Remsky talked about in his article that included belittling his son when he had big emotions. He had a young toddler, and he found that when his son was expressing big emotions, he said that something in his body wanted him to stop, that he wanted him to get over it, ignore it, shake it off, and stop crying. And he realized that by feeling this way towards his son, he was passing on this pattern of minimization and passing on a form of toxic masculinity, and found that it was something that he didn't want to do and decided to change his behavior. In the worst case scenario, minimizing can turn into gaslighting, which is a term that comes from a 1940s play and then 1944 film about a woman who's played by Ingrid Bergman and a husband who's played by Charles Boyer on the left, who slowly manipulates her into believing that she's going insane so that he can have her committed to an asylum. And to give you the context of the word gaslighting, the reason why that specific word is used is because in the plot, he goes up into the attic to secretly rummage through her belongings and steal her jewels, and she sees the flickering gaslight in the hallway because he turns the attic light on and it reduces the flow of gas to the downstairs lights. But he continues to tell her, you're imagining it, it's not real, it's all in your head. I don't want to spoil the movie for you if you ever decide to watch it, but this is why believing is so important. So often as an underrepresented minority, I just want to be seen. I just want somebody to see the reality that I see. More often than not, I live in a reality where I'm invisible. And many of us fade into invisibility. In 1999, Chicana artist Barbara Carrusco made this portrait in homage of Dolores Huerta. And she said that she did it because there are so many icons of men and icons of women painted by men that she wanted to, as a woman, create an iconic image of Huerta to recognize her as an equal of Cesar Chavez and historically the most important negotiator of the United Farm Workers. And I got to see her talk about this piece and other pieces a couple months ago, and she told the most fascinating story about how when the National Portrait Institute, or they placed this portrait into the National Portrait Catalog. Shepard Fairey was at the ceremony, and he was very curious, and he came and asked her a bunch of questions. And then in 2006, he painted a portrait of Obama with the words hope across the bottom that might make this portrait seem much more familiar now. And, you know, it's so often that the work of people who do great work is sometimes inspired by others, and usually when it's an underrepresented minority, we're not given credit. So it's important to give credit where credit is due. And oftentimes, faces and stories belong to different domains of experience, but they have one thing in common. We're trained from a very early age to consume them differently depending on the gender of their origin. So oftentimes, when we see a strong painting of a woman, we interpret it differently because it's a woman rather than a man. And this is called the male glance. Lily Loofbrow wrote an article about this in The Atlantic about how so often if a woman is not being objectified, she's being disregarded. And I think about Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Big Mama Thornton and how their work was eclipsed by the success of Elvis Presley. And I think about how the first programmers were women who were pushed out when people started perceiving the value of the work. And how now we honor some, but the industry is still very hostile. And this hostility often means that the paths of underrepresented minorities more frequently mean that to reach success, we go through trauma, and that trauma creates inside of us feelings of spite and or feelings of shame, where we feel spite for the fact that this person or this group of people put us through trauma. We feel shameful for the things that we failed at, and that pushes us to working harder, and that pushes us into success. And so often I've talked to other underrepresented minorities, and they describe these going through this experience. And And for me, I want to turn that around. I want to make a positive path, which is much more easily described as, when you have that inspiration, when you have an opportunity and you have encouragement and all of those things come together and they push you into being successful because the work is positive. And so I have a few tips for ways that we can avoid the path of trauma, avoid the path of spite and shame that eventually leads to success for underrepresented minorities, and give underrepresented minorities more access to the path of encouragement, the path of inspiration, the path of opportunity. This is an illustration of something that happens often on our teams, and Jason kind of talked about a little bit earlier with his discussion about how rock stars take on too much work. This is called Ringelmann Effect, which is that as a group gets bigger, individual production decreases. And so, as you see here, TJ Miller taking a hit off of a bong is doing what we call social loafing. But, I'm sure he's having a good time, but at least I don't think he gets credit in the show. I don't remember. I don't watch it. So social loafing is something that often you use social capital to be able to socially loaf, to get away with not having to do your share of the work. Oftentimes that means that you have to have privilege, you have to have social capital to do that. And that means that underrepresented minorities often pick up the slack. So to reduce social loafing and to increase team cohesion, we need to limit the scope of our projects. We need to keep our groups small. We need to divvy up responsibilities equitably to avoid diffusion of responsibility, to avoid this idea that it's not my job, it's not my responsibility. We have to make people take that responsibility explicitly. And all of this is a positive thing because people like getting credit. People like it when they are the ones who are responsible for something being successful. So if we reward coordination and we reward cooperation, we can avoid the Ringelmann effect. In one-on-ones, we need to ask underrepresented minorities about their communication styles. They come from different, oftentimes different cultures have different priorities for communication styles. And so, for example, I really love this recommendation that's on Project Include's website, which they recommend that if a disabled person joins your team, that you require that everyone post in Slack or via email first, setting the bar at an equal level ahead of time, so that if you're in an open office and people have access to getting up and going to someone else's desk, and you have a person who is disabled and is unable to physically exert themselves in that way, by setting the bar equitably ahead of time and talking about communication style, we can make sure that, as the famous slogan goes, nothing about us without us, that URMs are not left behind. Another thing that you can ask in a one-on-one scenario with people on your team is how we recharge. Oftentimes, we've had a lot of toxic experiences, and by asking us how we recharge and asking us the different toxic experiences that we want to avoid, you can help protect the underrepresented minorities on your team and be more aware of the things that you need to keep an eye out for. And ask them about what they need. They're the experts on their experience. You all only have to ask. Let's see. So, also, one of the biggest things that's holding back underrepresented minorities is vague feedback. The Harvard Business Review found that women were consistently receiving less feedback tied to business outcomes, and that vague feedback correlated with lower performance reviews, but only for women and not for men. Also, that stereotypes about women's caregiving abilities also cause reviewers to more frequently attribute accomplishments with teamwork rather than with leadership. So making sure that you're giving everyone on your team specific objectives so that they can move up, and specific feedback that's tied to business goals and business and outcomes, so that it's measurable, so that you have it down on paper, so that it's explicit. And in mentoring situations, if you're giving advice to someone else, make sure to check your privilege. Make sure to consider the power differential that exists between you, and to consider the fact that in their upbringing or in their life experience, they don't have access always. If you have more privilege than they do, they won't always be able to access the advice that you give them. Another important thing to do is to avoid broad generalizations so that we can reduce the amount of unconscious bias that accidentally leaks out of us. I also like to talk about how if somebody does something that you perceive as wrong, get more context before you try to correct them. Spend a little bit of time learning, asking them how they learned it and what their source of learning was before you jump the gun and tell them, oh, this is wrong, this isn't right, we don't do it this way. Because oftentimes there's different contexts and you might learn something in turn. I also really love when my first job was actually as a Taekwondo instructor, so I learned a lot about how to teach because I had to work with toddlers and they don't really want to learn anything. They just want to run around and do handstands. But what I learned was that to keep their attention, to have a positive effect and to keep them from feeling like I was being mean to them, I had to do a thing that we called praise, correct, praise. So when I was mentoring someone that I don't know what their experience is, I don't know the context of their experience, it always helps to be positive. So first, by praising something that they did right, and then correcting the thing that you want them to change, to do better, providing them with feedback on how to do it better, and then when they do it better the next time, make sure to praise them in response to that. You know, having positive feedback helps keep people engaged. It helps them feel like they can trust you. It helps them feel safe. And also, as underrepresented minorities, we're often trained to say yes, and we fear retribution. And in a power imbalance situation, as a lead, as a manager, it's important to respect someone of an underrepresented background when they say no, and to respect that they know their experience and have open communication with them about why they said no, and so that you can learn from that. Because culture doesn't make people, people make culture. One of the other things that I love to use to describe the differences between cultures when they come together is the concept of asking culture versus guessing culture. Asking culture is when a certain group of people, they feel that it is acceptable socially to ask for anything because they're willing to, they will not be upset by receiving a negative answer. That they have no expectations, and therefore they will ask for anything because in the hopes that a yes will provide them with what they want. But oftentimes, as an underrepresented minority, I was brought up in more of a guessing culture, which is that I avoided putting a request into words unless I was sure that the answer was going to be yes. And this is important to realize because when an asker runs into a guesser and they ask for something, the guesser is operating from a position of assuming that they need to give this person a yes, that they need to give this person what they're asking for. And that puts undue burden on people such as myself. And because we feel obligated, and especially when there's a power imbalance. Another situation of a power imbalance is this is called ring theory. It was written by Susan Silk, who is a psychologist. She wrote an article in the LA Times. She was diagnosed with breast cancer, and while she was in the hospital, she had friends coming to her crying about like how awful it was that this was happening to them because it made their lives harder. And obviously this was not okay, and she wanted to find a better way to articulate this. So she came up with ring theory, which is this idea that the aggrieved or the afflicted is in the center. And as you are farther and farther attached to this person, you exist in a farther and farther ring out. And that within the rings, you're only supposed to comfort in, but you can dump out. So if you have an underrepresented minority on your team and you're upset about stuff that's happening in the news, try to provide them with comfort and give them an outlet to dump out instead of dumping out to them, since they are the ones who are the most aggrieved or afflicted by the situation. And in group settings, I learned working at restaurants to celebrate small wins. By celebrating small wins, you give people a positive reinforcement for the good work that they're doing. You keep them open and trusting and feeling safe on the team. And, hopefully this will bring your teams closer together. But, you're going to mess up. Everybody messes up, and it's okay. So when you mess up, it's important to remember how to apologize. The first thing that needs to happen is you need to listen and believe the experiences of the person who you've wronged and own what you did. Because I always assumed that people don't have bad intentions when I call them out on something that they did wrong. If I thought that they had bad intentions, I would disengage, I would block, I would remove myself from the unsafe environment, and I wouldn't talk to the person about what they did. But if I feel safe enough with that person, if I feel that I can trust them enough, and I can ask them, I can challenge them to be better, then when I call someone out and they get defensive, what it tells me is that they didn't listen to me, that they didn't believe me. And so when you take accountability for that, when you listen to them and you own what you did, then you apologize, then you can make the space to repair what happened. And the person who's going to tell you how to repair is the person who you're going to learn how to repair the mistake by listening to the person who was wronged, by asking them what you can do better, by giving them the space and respecting them. So if they decide to disengage, if they say, you're asking too much, I can't help you with this, that means that it's time for you to do your own education. That means that there's plenty of reading material out there that's available on issues having to do with race and gender and all of the different oppressed identities. And because the process of being inclusive is not linear. This is an excellent graph put together by The Mouse and the Elephant, which is a newsletter and resource on inclusivity. But the one thing that I would want to fix with this graph is that the graph is linear. Really, this process is cyclical. And because as you learn, there will be new things that you realize that you weren't aware of. And instead of seeing it as like you have to fix everything all at once, it's important to see it as picking the things that are visible to you, asking for advice on what it is that needs to get fixed. Because the people on your team are the ones who already know what needs to be fixed. And if there's some of the things that I also recommend that I would add to this graph is that it's important to set inclusive goals in the shapes of requirements and quotas, just like how feedback needs to be explicit, so do your goals, and how you get there, and setting quotas for things. If there's a conflict, screen for bias. If there's a conflict, before you address the conflict, make sure to check your biases and see if there's an assumption. If there was an assumption that you make, ask yourself why you made that assumption. And get as much context as you can when there's a grievance. There's many, many resources available. Open Sourcing Mental Illness has fantastic resources on how to support people who are suffering from chronic illnesses, mental illnesses. Project Include has many resources on their site. The Mouse and the Elephant is a great newsletter, and I highly recommend the book So You Want to Talk About Race. says everything that I would want to say way better. But just to give you an example of what our experiences are like and the kind of world that we need to make space for and the ways that we need to make space for people. I want to show you, this is a poem by Melissa Lozado Oliva. She's a Latinx poet. She performed this poem at the 2015 National Poetry Slam, and it was a response to another poet who did a performance called, he called his poem Like Totally Whatever, and it was a poem where basically he was tone policing people and saying that phrasing your sentences as questions, using words like and in between was causing conversation to become something that was sad and not as fun, and that he wanted to see more confidence in people, and he wanted to see people take initiative for what they had to say. And I think that this is the perfect way to understand how the experiences of underrepresented minorities are important to listen to and to believe.
Like Totally Whatever, after Taylor Molly. In case you haven't realized, it has somehow become necessary for old white men to tell me how to speak. They interrupt a conversation that isn't even theirs and are speak like you mean it. And the internet is ruining the English language, and they put my parentheticals, my likes and ums and your knows on a wait list. Tell them no one will take them seriously in a frilly pink dress or that makeup. Tell them they have a confidence problem, that they should learn to speak up like the hyper-masculine words who are always the first to raise their hands. Invisible red pens and college degrees have been making their way into the middle of my sentences. I've been crossing things out every time I take a moment to think. Declarative sentences, so-called because they declared themselves to be the loudest, most truest, most taking up the most space, most totally white man sentences, have always told me that being angry has never helped anybody, has only gotten in the way of helping them declare more shit about how they'll never be forgotten ever. It's like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Ernest Hemingway were geniuses for turning women into question marks. It's like rapes happen all the time on campuses, but as soon as John Krakauer writes about it, suddenly it's innovative nonfiction and not something girls are making up for attention. And it's maybe I'm always speaking in questions because I'm so used to being cut off. It's maybe this is defense mechanism. Maybe everything girls do is evolution of defense mechanism. This is protection. Our likes are our knee pads. Our ums are the knives we tuck into our boots at night. Our you knows are the best friends we call when we're walking down a dark alley. This is how we breathe easier. But I guess feelings never helped anybody. I guess tears never made change. I guess everything girls do is a waste of time. So welcome to the bandwagon of my own uncertainty. Watch as I stick flowers in your punctuation mark guns, because you can't just challenge authority. You gotta take it to the mall too. Teach it to do the bend and snap, paint its nails, braid its hair, tell it looks really good today, and in that moment, before you murder it with all of the poison in your softness, you let it know that this moment is me using my voice.
I love that poem because that poem is the howl that I always wanted to let out. And I hope that when you go back to your teams after this conference and you see and you ask about the experiences, that you give the underrepresented minorities on your team the chance to let out what they need to howl, so that we don't lose the best hearts of our generation. Thank you.